Up next, we have Meghna Singh. She is a student at the University of Michigan. She's studying community and global public health, which, if we've learned anything over the past 2 years, is crucially important. She also has minors in Spanish and education. Her passion for mental health advocacy and suicide prevention efforts was sparked when her community faced 2 youth suicide clusters. Meghna's talk is called Everyone Has a Mental Health, Lessons Learned from a Suicide Loss Survivor and Student Suicide Prevention Advocate. Meghna will highlight her personal experience as a suicide loss survivor and someone who has dealt with seasons of depression and anxiety. She will talk about her advocacy efforts, which started back in 2014, how they've evolved to date, and how it has helped her heal. It will highlight her experience advocating for mental health within diverse communities, including amongst her South Asian family and friends. Finally, she will provide recommendations regarding how everyone can advocate for their well-being in their everyday lives.
Thank you so much for the introduction. A few months ago, I was reflecting on my mental health promotion and suicide prevention work thus far, and I realized that I've been advocating for 1/3 of my life, 7 years. And it seems like just yesterday, I was turning to Google to search, what is mental health and what are signs of depression? I know that I'm not the only person to have typed these questions into a search engine in response to themselves or a loved one struggling. But these simple Google searches have led me to where I am today, a passionate and dedicated advocate for mental health promotion and suicide prevention at the age of 21. And I'm honored to be here with you today. Hi, everyone. My name is Meghna Singh, pronoun she, her, hers, and I'm a daughter, sister, friend, partner, person of color, specifically from Northern India, a student, and an advocate. I'm a senior at the University of Michigan studying public health. I'm a suicide loss survivor multiple times over, and I've worked through various seasons of depression in my personal life. I'm honored to be one of the speakers at the 5th annual Grit and Grace Multicultural Women's Mental Health Conference. I'll be sharing my personal mental health journey, advocacy efforts, and roadblocks along the way, especially amongst the South Asian community, as well as strategies regarding how you can take care of your own well-being and support those around you. Here's a roadmap of what I'll be sharing today. Note that while I share my own self-care tips and advocacy efforts, my story does touch upon the topic of suicide. I welcome you to reflect on how you're feeling and if you're in a headspace to hear this story. If not, don't feel pressured to listen in this moment. It was 2014 when I first started my deep dive into mental health through the most reputable source that I had access to at the time, Google. As soon as I started typing, what is mental health, I felt comforted by the search engine's auto-populate feature, knowing that I wasn't the only person who had asked this question before. This was the first millisecond of comfort that I had felt in days. Let me give you some context into what was going on at the time. My brother's best friend had just taken his own life. He died by suicide. He was 16 years old and a part of the second youth suicide cluster that my community had faced within a span of 5 years. With suicide being the second leading cause of death amongst those ages 10 to 34, according to the CDC at the time, my hometown, unfortunately, was not an outlier. I became aware that young people in the US and worldwide have been struggling with their mental health, and that struggle, unfortunately, continues to date. Hearing that a young person took their life was an incredulous shock. I felt confused, angry, lost, and heartbroken, to name just a few emotions. This was the first person close to me who had passed away in my life. It was the first funeral that I attended, and it was for a peer. That was really hard to grapple with. At the time of his passing, I was 14 years old. I was an 8th grade student and the oldest and wisest of the school, thriving in classes and with a solid social network. We were advised not to come to school if we were sick, and we were sent to the nurse's office if we got injured in gym class, but we rarely talked about mental health and well-being. It was as if it didn't exist. That couldn't be farther from the truth. Like many others communities, there's a profound stigma in our community to talk about anything that had to do with the mind that wasn't focused on intellect and academics. But just because mental health wasn't being talked about didn't mean that students weren't struggling. Whether it be from challenging academics or pressure to be a first-generation high school graduate, to non-education related stressors like food insecurity and caring for family members, students were struggling with their well-being. So, what is mental health and how does it impact us? That's what I started Googling and have truly never stopped. I wanted to provide a brief overview of what I learned about mental health early on. According to mentalhealth.gov, mental health is our emotional, psychological, and social well-being, which impacts how we think, act, and feel. It's on a spectrum that may fluctuate regularly, and in some cases can result in a mental health condition and clinical diagnosis. There are diverse causes ranging from biological factors like genetics and family history to environmental factors such as stress, trauma, and adverse life experiences. I initially started doing research solely to grieve. I was desperate to try to understand why a young person might consider taking their life. How does one's untreated mental health leave people feeling so helpless and alone? While we may not know all the answers, researchers worldwide have made incredible strides into learning more about mental health and suicide risk. It actually felt comforting knowing that there are signs and symptoms that you can look out for in yourself or in a loved one who's having a tough time emotionally. As a result of my own grief, I made it my mission to support my peers who were struggling and work to prevent suicide. I committed to learning about signs and symptoms of mental health conditions, distress, and suicidal ideation. Advocacy is how I healed over the years and how I continue to honor the memory of loved ones that I have lost to suicide. I believe that everyone should be aware of the signs and symptoms of common mental health conditions like depression. Knowing this information can truly save lives. Early on in my learning, I gathered as much information that I could through Google, typed it into a document, and shared it with my networks informally. However, the following acronym that I'm going to talk about was shared with me by a psychiatrist in my community, and it's taught in medical school, and therefore is evidence-based. I know that my mom, who's a doctor, used this acronym, SIGGY CAPS, to connect the dots when I was struggling with my mental health in high school. So I'm proof that it does work. Each letter represents a behavior that one should be aware of amongst someone who may be feeling depressed. And remember, having this knowledge is really powerful. You should look for changes in sleep, such as insomnia or oversleeping, reduced interest and a loss in pleasure in activities that someone used to enjoy, feelings of guilt, a decrease in energy or mental and physical fatigue, decrease in concentration or increased distractibility, changes in one's appetite, and this could be a decrease or an increase, psychomotor changes such as differences in speech or movement speed, and lastly, suicidal ideation or thoughts, plans, or behaviors that one may end their life. Early on in my advocacy journey, I took this information and initiated conversations with my peers about how they were truly doing. I hope to be an open ear for my friends to listen to whatever was going on in their life, offer a hug, or advice. I especially paid attention to SIGGY CAPS, and over time, it became second nature to look out for signs of depression. Knowing this information is so important since after the pandemic, the World Health Organization found a 25% increase in depression and anxiety globally. Over the past 2 to 3 years, and even to date, many people have experienced stress, anxiety, loneliness, as well as loss and sadness. So knowing this information is important now more than ever. If I noticed someone was struggling, I would be there to comfort them, while also recognizing that I'm not a trained mental health professional who can offer clinical care. Instead, I connected them to trusted adults like educators, staff members at my school, parents and caregivers, or mental health professionals who could handle the situation from there. I was lucky that my high school had a staff specifically dedicated to mental health who worked at our school's wellness center and took student and staff referrals. If it was outside business hours, which it often was, I would reach out to national resources with the person in crisis. For example, to what is now 988 or the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. I especially love to inform people that there are texting options as well, since I know many teens, like myself, don't like talking on the phone. I'll share all of these resources a bit later for your reference. These advocacy efforts started small. They began with informal conversations where I would try to create a space where my peers could share how they were feeling, and we could work together to come up with strategies regarding how they could support their well-being. I can't reiterate enough the power of conversation. It can truly save someone's life and provide them with feelings of connection and hope. I wanted to share a few of my favorite advocacy initiatives that I've led over the past few years among youth and young adults in my communities to help you brainstorm ideas of what you can bring to youth in your networks or pass it along to other mental health advocates. I brought a petting zoo or a mobile barnyard to my high school during finals at the end of each semester to encourage students to de-stress with adorable farm animals. I partnered with a local organization in my area that offered this service after getting approval from school administrators. I also hosted a teen mental health conference with over 20 workshops and 200 attendees where Bay Area youth could learn about mental health, therapy, forms of self-care, and more. Many young people were eager to learn about well-being and connect with other advocates, as well as organizations that support the mission. Creating a space for them to connect is key, especially opportunities that are free. Just last month, I created care packages for students with fidget toys, stickers, 988 resources, printed mental health pamphlets, and positive messages of support that were distributed across campus. Young people, and maybe everyone, love free stuff. So these mental health care packages, coupled with passing out free food like candy, donuts, or pizza, is a fun activity that attracts a lot of people and brightens their day. Additionally, many of my peers actually wanted to learn how they could support their friends who were struggling with their mental health. So I informally hosted trainings where I talked about active listening, asking open-ended questions, signs and symptoms of depression and anxiety, and what resources to reach out to if one is considering ending their life. And over the years, I have learned about great evidence-based trainings that highlight this information and more, such as Teen Mental Health First Aid and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention's Talk Saves Lives presentation. Some of these events have been huge milestones in my life, and I'm incredibly, incredibly proud of. Hearing people's gratitude when they see these activities, whether they are big events or small initiatives on campus, is so meaningful. Every effort impacted at least one person, and to me, that makes it absolutely worth it. My advocacy journey hasn't always been smooth sailing, though. As incredible as these initiatives were, they were equally met with pushback, hesitancy, and to be quite honest, a lot of eye rolls from adults. When I first started advocating for well-being, I would receive blank stares when I mentioned mental health. Granted, this was in 2014, 2015, many years prior to the pandemic when everyone faced incredible stressors which negatively impacted well-being. Many people couldn't find the words to describe mental health at first due to the lack of awareness and understanding of the topic. And other folks whispered the term because it had been so stigmatized in their community, they felt ashamed to name it and share how they were truly feeling. This was my experience when I talked to some family members, friends, and community members in the South Asian community. I personally identify as Northern Indian, and for many years, I received great pushback that mental health isn't real or important from my community. It was especially hard for people to grapple with the topic, since mental health is often connected to internal thoughts and emotions. It's in the mind, and at times can feel like it's invisible and therefore not worthy of support. I learned over the years that there are a variety of reasons why mental health wasn't and isn't talked about in the South Asian community. And on the next slide, I share some stigmatized phrases that I have heard and some of the strategies that I've used to push back in a kind and hopefully educational way. For example, talking about mental health challenges or any struggle you have will bring shame to the family. The community will judge you and our family, and you are considered weak. But to me, being open about your struggles and being vulnerable is a superpower. It's something that we should all applaud. I've also heard that everyone has problems. Yours aren't worse than anyone else's, so you shouldn't complain or speak up about it. And yes, everyone does face adversity, but that doesn't invalidate what you're going through. Other people have said you shouldn't speak up about it because it's not real. But mental health is a real health condition. There are a variety of factors contributing to the development, and it can be treated. I've also heard that you're thought of as crazy, dangerous, and irresponsible. But in reality, people are able to live full, safe lives every day with a mental health condition. And it's actually a myth that every person with a mental illness is violent. And lastly, I've heard that it's caused by oneself due to a lack of self-discipline. And this isn't true at all. There are genetic, environmental, and behavioral factors, all of which contribute. And some of these factors are truly out of your control. While it was hard to understand how mental health was such a taboo topic, even though so many young people were struggling, I was hopeful that I could make a difference by starting conversations in my communities about mental health. And over time, I hope that the stigma would decrease. I started sharing about what I was experiencing personally through my seasons of depression and what my peers were struggling with mentally, with their consent, of course. For some people, personal anecdotes were powerful and provided them with new perspectives. For other people, they could care less about personal stories. They wanted data. Facts and statistics like leading causes of death, the burden of disease, and how many lives are lost each year to mental health concerns and suicide is what motivated them to act. So I memorized these statistics right away. For example, according to the National Alliance of Mental Illness, or NAMI, 1 in 5 US adults experience a mental illness each year. 1 in 6 youth ages 6 to 17 experience a mental illness annually. 50% of all lifetime mental illnesses begin by age 14 and 75% by age 24, which is right around my age group. Suicide is the second leading cause of death amongst those ages 10 to 14 and 25 to 34, according to the CDC in 2020, and the third leading cause of death amongst people ages 15 to 24. And lastly, 46,000 people die by suicide annually in the United States, and more than 700,000 people nationwide. And we actually know that these numbers are underreported due to the stigmatization of this cause of death. To advocate for the investment in well-being, I was vulnerable about my personal struggles with mental health. I shared key statistics with the goal of educating people about the severity of the problem. Through these conversations, my goal was for people to find ways to support young folks' mental health and their own. And now I want to share a bit about my own mental health story and what activities helped me through it, in hopes that it encourages one person to reflect on their well-being and reach out for support if you need it. I've struggled with seasons of depressive symptoms on and off throughout high school and college. I was not clinically diagnosed. However, many of the signs and symptoms that I previously mentioned were ones that I experienced, such as a loss in appetite, weight loss, not engaging in activities that previously brought me joy, and difficulty sleeping, to name a few. So my sophomore year of high school, I started going to therapy. I saw a social worker who was one of the many different mental health providers available to support folks who are going through a tough time. It was through this experience that I was able to develop coping skills and tools in my mental health toolkit that I continue to use to date. Of all the homework assignments that I was assigned, I was asked to try in therapy. There was one in particular that I loved and have continued to practice to date, almost 5 years later. I was asked to document what happened each day and score my mood on a scale of 1 to 10. At first, I dreaded this activity. It was hard for me to remember what happened just the day before, but with practice, like most things, it became easier over time. After a few weeks, it was helpful for me to see how my score would change slightly each day based on what was going on in my life, which is totally normal, by the way. I was essentially collecting data points that allowed me to see patterns in my mood, and if my mood scored below a 4 or a 5 for multiple days in a row, this signaled to me that I should reach out for support. The second activity that I do to support my mental health was inspired by my high school mentor. He invited his students to write 3 things that we were grateful for at the start of each class during the month of November, which was called the Thankfulness Challenge. I really took this challenge to heart by junior year of high school when I was dealing with a lot of adversity in my life. Since January 1st, 2019 until now, I have written in my journal my mood on a scale of 1 to 10 and one thing that I'm grateful for each day, with the goal of trying not to repeat items each month. This activity, founded in gratitude, has been a game changer for me. It helps me shift my perspective from day-to-day struggles and frustrations that I often get caught up in, and instead encourages me to think about the people, places, and things that I can rely on and turn to for support. I recommend sharing these 2 activities with other people in your life and give it a try yourself. I hope that from hearing about my experience as a suicide loss survivor and someone who has struggled with seasons of depression, and the coping mechanisms that I have shared can come in handy for you or someone else in your life. I believe that everyone has a mental health, and it exists on a spectrum. Some days might be better than others, but just like your mood, it's normal for your mental health to fluctuate, especially in the wake of challenges or exciting accomplishments. If you're feeling unlike yourself and down for 2 to 3 weeks or more, this may be a sign that you should talk to a mental health professional. And when you're facing adversity or simply just having an off day, here are a few suggestions that I have. I recommend journaling, doodling, or using voice memos to capture your thoughts. You don't need any fancy equipment or rules to follow, rather a way for you to process what's going on in your mind in a way that works for you. Consider practicing yoga or meditation, where you try to calm your mind and focus on your breath. Another tool that I recommend is Sources of Strength. It's a framework that I love and is an evidence-based bullying, substance use, and suicide prevention program for youth. While I taught this program in high school, I still use it to date. There are 8 spokes of the wellness wheel for you to reflect on and work towards bettering: family support, positive friends, mentors, healthy activities, generosity, spirituality, physical health, and of course, mental health. No matter your age, I think these categories are so relevant. I would love for you to take a moment to reflect on what spokes of the Sources of Strength wheel you're strong in and what you can improve on. Additionally, the state of Illinois passed a law to provide student with mental health days, where they can be absent from school and make up the work with no penalty to prioritize student well-being. I think this request is starting to be a bit more common in schools and in the workplace, and I hope policies are being put in place for youth and adults alike in support of well-being and taking breaks when you need them. Additionally, there are various types of doctors like psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors, and social workers, and some of them offer sliding scale fees to adjust to your financial situation, who can provide you with therapy to support your well-being. A good place to start is your primary care physician, if you have one, since you may have already built a trusted relationship with them. It's just as valid to bring up mental health issues as it is physical health. There are also many therapy organizations available virtually who can offer clinical care nationwide. And lastly, there are resources such as 988, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, which you can call, text, or chat online to connect with a trained crisis counselor who can help people experiencing a suicidal, substance use, or mental health crisis, or any other form of emotional distress. You can also call 988 if you're worried about a loved one or need support to help someone through a tough time. Services are available in English and Spanish, as well as interpretation in over 250 languages. Thank you so much for having me today at the 5th Annual Grit and Grace Multicultural Women's Mental Health Conference. It was an absolute honor to be able to share my story with you. I hope there was at least one part of my experience that impacted you and that you'll pass on to someone else who may be going through a tough time. Thank you to everyone who is already promoting mental health in your community. And for those of you who are considering bringing initiatives to your networks, it's never too late to start. Lastly, it's so important to prioritize your well-being now more than ever. Please take care of yourselves and look out for each other. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Meghna. That did way more than impact just in one specific way. Your story, your resources, your data is impacting so many people who are here today. We have a ton of people asking if we can get those slides, if we can get that speech for later on. And I do want to let you know that we will be sharing a recording of this presentation later on. Once it is completed, we will also work on getting those data points and getting those slides to our viewers. Your your speech, your talk is clearly resonating with so many people as you raise so many important points there. And so I want to remind people, I know that we have a lot of activity in the chat right now, but if you have any questions for Meghna, if you want to ask her more, if you want to see if she can explain more of that data, please drop that question in the chat box. We are keeping track of people who are asking those questions, and then we can address those questions during the talking circle. So again, Meghna, thank you for all you did for that presentation.